It is standard practice in modern biology to obtain and designate a type specimen to represent an entire species. This is a picture of the type for the Kimberley cave bat. And here's one for the Rugel's plantain. In the case of us, Homo sapiens, it is somewhat controversial, but it seems the specimen that is most widely accepted is Carl Linnaeus, also known as Carl von Linné, even though his remains are buried in his grave and not in a glass case. In some respects, this is an excellent choice, because it was Linnaeus who first described Homo sapiens as a member of the primates in the definitive 10th edition of Systema Naturae, his most famous work. In fact, he created the terms Homo sapiens, primate, and mammal, while organizing the classification system that is still used today. Naming Linnaeus as the type specimen is also supported by the rules of the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, established around the beginning of the 1900s. The specimen should be provided by the person who named the species, which I suppose is technically true, it's provided, and priority goes to the first namer unless there are good reasons to overrule the first type. In this case, the British botanist William Stern proposed Linnaeus in 1959. In addition, Linnaeus has nearly become a divine figure within biological classification, or taxonomy. I mean, his nicknames include the father of modern taxonomy and the second Adam, as it was Adam to whom God gave the responsibility of naming the animals. A third qualification to represent the human race? He is the namesake of the world's oldest extant biological society, the Linnean Society of London. Notice the spelling, there is no A. So this is the same society where Darwin and Wallace's papers on evolution by natural selection were first presented in 1858. However, Linnaeus is also partially responsible for giving justification to several generations of scientists and policymakers who promoted white Euro supremacy on the belief that there was a hierarchy naturally ingrained in human species or human varieties. So appointing a white European as the representative of Homo sapiens is problematic, and I'll get into that issue at the end of this video. Linnaeus lived and died almost exactly a century before Charles Darwin, and there are remarkable parallels between the two lives. One big difference, however, was that Linnaeus was not born rich. It seems he became a living legend through his tenacity and sociability, plus, like Darwin, through luck and social connections. Time and time again, people who met young Linnaeus liked him and recognized his potential. He was invited to live and learn with scholars around his native Sweden, as well as France, Germany, Netherlands, and England. Like Darwin, he was provided the chance as a young man to travel to an unknown territory for scientific research. When he was 24 years old, he undertook a 6-month tour of Lapland in northern Scandinavia, where Darwin got his finches in Galapagos. From Lapland, Linnaeus got his twin flower, later to be named Linnea borealis by an admiring colleague. Linnaeus would go on to name hundreds of previously unclassified plant species from the Lapland trip, and this classification of plants and animals would turn out to be the foundation of his life's work. He is credited with giving names to around 9,000 plants and 4,000 animals, most of which are still in use today. Here are two examples: Capsicum annuum and Canis lupus. Linnaeus's major innovation was to fit every life form into a unique two-word name, to correspond with the genus and species taxonomic levels, a system now called binomial nomenclature. He also recognized that some organisms should be distinguished at levels more specific than species, usually called subspecies. And with domesticated organisms, subspecies may be further divided into cultivars for plants and breeds for animals. Now, to a modern listener, calling this animal gorilla may not seem like an efficient system, but each level has a well-defined meaning that is agreed upon by the global community of biologists. In pre-Linnaean classification, researchers used long Latin descriptions for names, such as this: plantain with pubescent ovate lanceolate leaves, a cylindrical spike, and a terete scape. So the current binomial, plantago media, which was given by Linnaeus, is certainly easier to say, but it's also easier to know its family relationship with other plantains. Linnaeus, of course, couldn't have known about genetics or even really evolution, so he based his classifications on phenotypes, or physical and behavioral characteristics. In plants, he used things such as reproductive methods, or number of leaves and petals. In animals, he also used reproduction and number and type of teeth, among so much more. And for the most part, these observations have really held up remarkably to genetic analysis. Certainly some groupings of species, genus, or the other ranks introduced by Linnaeus, such as order and class, have changed. Because genetic sequencing technologies have improved so much over the past 2 decades, taxonomists' views have shifted to cladistics, often represented by phylogenetic trees, which are not so different from the family trees you may have seen within your own family. When I was born, there was only one recognized species of gorilla. Now there are 2, each of which are further divided into 2 subspecies. In 2017, a new species of orangutan was announced based on updated genetic data. Until we had good molecular data, many scientists assumed humans were the most unique branch of apes. But the consensus now is that humans, along with chimpanzees, and that also means bonobos, are the least unique of the 5 apes. And in fact, the gibbons are the most unique. But all of this refinement is carried out under the Linnean system, made possible because there is a well-defined code and good science is self-correcting. It's not perfect, of course. Linnaeus's division of the classes of animals has largely carried on today, even though phylogenetic data suggests birds are a completely nested set within reptiles. From an evolutionary point of view, it is illogical to consider reptiles, birds, and even mammals as unique groups. This is particularly true of birds, as paleontologist Jack Horner explained at TED 2011.
So, we have discovered that dinosaur DNA, and all DNA, just breaks down too fast. We're just not going to be able to do what they did in Jurassic Park. We're not going to be able to make a dinosaur based on a dinosaur. But birds are dinosaurs. Birds are living dinosaurs. We actually classify them as dinosaurs. We now call them non-avian dinosaurs and avian dinosaurs. So the non-avian dinosaurs are the big clunky ones that went extinct. Avian dinosaurs are our modern birds. So we don't have to make a dinosaur. So I already have them. The chicken is a dinosaur. I mean, it really is. I mean, you can't argue with it because we're the classifiers and we've classified it that way.
There is also disagreement at the top level of kingdom. Linnaeus, unaware of microbial life, only named two: animals and plants. Now, depending on your age and the inclination of your textbook, you may have learned in school that there are 3, 4, 5, or 6 kingdoms, or maybe you learned that domain is a higher classification than kingdom. I don't have any strong feelings about it, but I do think the 3 domains model of woes fits well with current evidence of evolutionary development. I also wonder whether the Linnean system is a good fit, is a perfect fit for microbes whose reproductive systems are so different from those of macroscopic organisms for whom the list was created. But, this is the current paradigm of classification, and while imperfect, it does allow the community to continue their dialogue, at least until a critical number of holes are punched in the Linnean system. In an eye-opening course on the history of scientific racism back in my university days, so as my recollection goes, my teacher presented Linnaeus as kind of the prime villain in the story of creating a racial human hierarchy of the world, where European whites were the top, and American reds, meaning indigenous Americans, were second, Asian yellows were third, and African blacks were at the lowest of the humans. But I'd like to add more nuance to this story. Linnaeus was not the first to assign colors to the groups of people of the world, nor was he the first white supremacist. The year before the first edition of Systema Naturae was published, for example, the great Voltaire wrote that whites, Negroes, the yellow races are not descended from the same man, among other disgusting things about how the white race was superior to others. That's not a unique thing to say. It's pervasive among all of our heroes of philosophy and science. Most of our heroes. So, Linnaeus was more subtle than people like Voltaire, though. Actually, just as with other taxonomic entries, the order of the list of human varieties does not imply hierarchy. In fact, it changed among different versions of his book. But we can see how he feels by looking at his descriptions. So, where he carefully differentiated other animals by teeth, heart, locomotion, well, look at how he describes humans. Americans, meaning indigenous Americans, are red, proud, and governed by custom. So he also describes their eyes, hair, nose, face, and chin, and more parts of their personality. He gives this type of account for all races, despite likely never having spoken to a non-European. So let's look at the next 3 and see if you can spot the one that sounds the best. Europeans are white, sociable, and governed by law. And they wear tight clothes. Really? Okay, next. Asians are yellow, sensitive, and governed by opinion. And Asians wear loose clothing. And the lurid yellow, which Linnaeus used, was associated with the disease jaundice. Okay, next. Africans are black, peaceful, and governed by impulse. And they have highly lactating breasts. Linnaeus, who was so careful to get consistent and measurable data for his plant classifications, was so terribly wrong in his dividing of humans, Now, his information came second or third hand from other Europeans, like Thomas Jefferson, who have the point of view of a colonizer or a slaveholder. But these categories, or something like them, have carried on today. They have staying power. Just ask an English speaker, how many races are there? And I think they're going to tell you something like the 4 that Linnaeus gave us, plus maybe a brown to include Latinos, or maybe a brown for Arabs, depending on who you're talking to. To clarify just how wrong he was about the racial categories, let me go further. He actually named 2 more subspecies of Homo: wild humans, or feral humans, and monstrous humans. Later generations actually ignored these 2 mistakes, but not the 4-race system, even though, really, he had just as little justifiable data. Linnaeus did pull together far-reaching data on plants to tell us, say, how flowers of Northern Europe relate to those of North America. And his descriptions and classifications have turned out to be pretty accurate by modern standards. So, if he knew that much about flowers, he must also have known about the geography and traits of humans. So, gentlemen like Thomas Jefferson would have assumed. Please also recall that Linnaeus was a physician, and this respected doctor applied the still popular 4 humors system to match the races of humans. How wonderful, he must have said to himself, that everything fits together as part of God's divine plan. And now the racial system was codified. He, the second Adam, had authorized it. So Linnaeus is the guy who received the following praise from Goethe. With the exception of Shakespeare and Spinoza, I know no one among the no longer living who has influenced me more strongly. By Goethe, the legendary celebrity Goethe, who was himself called the lost universal genius. If we are generous, we can say that Linnaeus was misguided in his unscientific characterization of human varieties. But many of his followers took it steps further, such as by using physiology and anatomy to demonstrate that the races have separate origins, and thus non-whites are different kinds of animals. So these are people like Blumenbach, Morton, or Spencer, who were talented in many ways, but were also white supremacists, whose biases led them to make awful scientific mistakes. And as the slave trade accelerated in the years after Linnaeus' death, generations of white people could know that they were scientifically proven to be biologically superior to the black enslaved races. I mean, it was written there in one of the most reputable scientific books of the time. Let me clarify, in case I've created any confusion around human origins. The scientific consensus is absolutely clear. All humans have a common origin in Eastern or Southern Africa, and populations at different times began migrating to Asia at around 150,000 years ago. Based on cladistics and genetic diversity, white Europeans are among the least diverse groups of humans. If one wished to create scientifically updated racial groups, which I am not advocating, white Europeans would need to be nested within a larger group that contains Arabs and other various peoples from the Middle East and North Africa. In the end, we have to remember that just as Darwin was really into collecting barnacles and documenting plant reproduction, and then he happened to write an incredible book on evolution, Linnaeus was a botanist and a doctor who happened to write an incredible book on taxonomy. Now, Linnaeus was really interested in flower sex and human mothers breastfeeding of their babies. He said it was really healthy, and he was right. But he was also an accidental and haphazard cultural theorist after his trip to Lapland. He was an open-minded, non-specialized scientist who helped jump biology ahead by several decades. But he also, inadvertently, I think, provided venomous weapons for racism to acquire scientific edge for 2 centuries and counting.